Today we're going to focus specifically on voter turnout. Why do we care? Well, a prominent political scientist named Larry Sabato wrote in a famous book called Pendulum Swing that every election is determined by the people who show up. What he means by this is that when one of the parties gets more of its supporters to the polls, that will determine the election. And so what we've seen over the past several years is that the composition of voters in presidential elections is very different than midterms, which helps explain why Democrats do so well during presidential years and Republicans do so well during midterm elections. So we're going to talk a little more about that later. For now, though, here's the big picture. The question is, why do some people show up to vote while others do not? In order to understand explanations for this, you have to understand that turnout has both an individual and a societal cause. What do we mean by that? We simply mean that there are things that go on in the individual's head, the individual causes, such as motivations, and we'll talk more about resources. All right? And there's also a societal cause. This is what we call mobilization. And it's critical to understand both because both are important parts of this overall explanation. We're going to talk about each one of these different factors separately, but keep in mind throughout the lecture that you really need to understand both, and they're very interrelated. So let's start off by talking about individual causes. First of all, people must decide to show up at the ballot box. It's an individual decision. Somebody wakes up in the morning on election day and they have to choose whether they're going to show up or not. So turnout occurs in real life. What do we mean by that? We mean that it's a physical act. You have to physically go to a polling place. So what that means is it's going to be influenced by real life stuff like weather, illness, car trouble, and work schedule. This is very different than things that explain who people vote for. To give you an example, somebody may wake up in the morning and having previously decided they were going to vote for, say, President Obama, but then they hear something on the news and they choose to vote for Governor Romney instead. However, very few people are going to wake up in the morning with the flu and think, well, I was going to vote for Obama, but by gosh, I'm going to vote for Romney now. All right? So the real life stuff influences the decision to show up at the ballot box, whereas it doesn't influence who people vote for at all. That's one of the major differences between understanding turnout, which we're talking about today, and understanding things like who people vote for, or the vote choice we sometimes call it. Another important aspect of turnout is that almost everything has some small effect. The weather, for instance, if it's snowing outside, some number of people are going to be dissuaded from showing up at the election. They're going to look outside and go, I'm not going to walk through negative 20-degree weather and heavy snow just to vote, right? And so car trouble, if you get involved in if you have a flat tire on the way to the ballot box, you might not show up. It's not a lot of people who are influenced by these idiosyncratic factors, but it's some small effect. So that's another way of saying that people have to be motivated to show up at the ballot box. They have to have some impetus that gets them there. And the turnout is influenced by some basic attitudes, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Sense of civic duty, interest in politics, right? People who are just more inherently interested in politics are more likely to make the car trip to the polls or to brave the weather. People who feel like voting and turning out is a part of their patriotic duty, they're more likely to show up at the polls despite the weather. When we talk about this individual decision, even though there are lots of things that influence turnout, we can boil it down to three basic questions that voters ask themselves. The first basic question is, what do I get out of it? We call these the benefits. These are things such as policy. Suppose you want tax cuts, and if the Republican wins, you'll get them. If the Democrat wins, you won't. Right? These are what we mean by benefits, what people get out of the election. The second major question is, how much of a hassle is this going to be? We use the word cost because voting, turning out to the polls, is actually a cost in terms of time, effort, and energy. It's also a resource issue in terms of information. People have to know something about the candidates, or else they'll feel like they shouldn't turn out to vote. And finally, does it make me feel good? This is what we call civic duty, or just duty for short. Basically, do people feel like it is their patriotic duty to show up to vote? Is it part of their definition of being a good citizen. Now we can put all three of these questions together into a cost-benefit analysis. This somewhat simple looking equation is voting equals benefits minus costs plus duty. Now you don't need to know the formula itself. We're going to revisit this and change it in a second, but it's just there as a heuristic or as a tool. If it helps, that's great. If it doesn't, you can ignore it. But basically, if this simple tool helps, then you can keep it in mind. If it doesn't, then you can ignore it. But when we talk about cost-benefit analysis, we basically mean, do the costs outweigh the benefits? And does the sense of civic duty outweigh the costs? When the hassles of voting are greater than the sense of civic duty or the benefits people get, then people stay home. If their sense of duty or the benefits they get is greater than the hassle, then they'll show up. That's the basic analysis at the individual level. So let's talk about each one of these. Benefits, what do we mean? We really are talking about policies, tax cuts, health care, even things like foreign policy. It's things people want out of government, and it's things that people want the politicians they elect to do. Second are the costs. We're really talking about time and energy. Yes, there is some small amount of money that goes into gas, but we're really talking about the time and effort it takes to be informed about the election, to take off from work. That costs people money, but it's also a bit of a hassle to get a few hours off of work to go to the poll. We're talking about the distance to the polls. People who live much farther away from their polling place are less likely to show up. And other things we've already talked about, weather, illness, car trouble. Again, the best way to understand costs is to understand we're really talking about the hassle it takes to physically get to the poll. And finally, sense of civic duty. Do citizens feel like they have a civic obligation to vote, and is voting part of their patriotic duty? Now, one thing we left out is the closeness of the election. We'll just call that the probability, and we'll talk more about this in a second. However, basically, the logic goes, if the election is predetermined, then why should I turn out to vote? I'm going to get the benefits whether I vote or not, so just let other people deal with the hassle. This is sometimes called a free rider problem if you come across that jargon, but basically the logic is that if the election is not close, if the outcome is already known, one candidate is clearly going to win, then people have a disincentive to show up to vote because, well, the election's predetermined and their vote's not going to make a difference. However, in a very, very close election where their vote might actually make a difference, then they're more likely to show up to vote because, well, then they're going to have more influence over the election. So this is what we mean when we talk about probability. Now, how do we incorporate this into that little formula? Well, we can weight the benefits by the probability of deciding the election. Let's suppose that I want some health care reform, and I will get that health care reform if the Democrat wins, and I will not get it if the Republican wins. In this case, if it's a close election, then whether I vote or not could actually make a difference in whether I get those benefits or not. However, if the Democrat is very likely to win, then I'm going to get the health care reform whatever I do. Or if the Republican's likely to win, then I'm not going to get the health care reform whatever I do. So we can revise this formula by saying voting equals probability times benefit minus cost plus duty. Right? That's what we mean when we say we weight the benefits by the closeness of the election. Notice that the probability really only influences the benefits. The hassles are the same whether the election is close or not, and the sense of civic duty sort of transforms the election, which means that if you have a patriotic duty to vote, then it doesn't matter how close the election is. It's just simply another way of saying that when we talk about the closeness of the election, we're really only saying that that has an effect on the benefits. So let's play a game. What do you think is the probability that your vote would determine the 2012 presidential election in Wyoming? I have a long list of different probabilities. Keep in mind that these are percentages. To say that I have a 50-50 probability would mean that I have a 50% chance. So the first probability I have is a 0.3% chance, but that's simply saying that's less than 1% chance. These are very, very small probabilities here. So let's just guess, which one of these do you think is a probability that your vote will determine the presidential election in Wyoming 2012? Maybe you think it's a 0.2%, and you would be incorrect. That's actually the probability that you'll die of cancer. This big number down near the bottom, 0.0001%, is actually the probability you'll win the lottery. This larger number, 0.3%, that's actually the probability that you'll die of heart disease. 0.01% is the probability you'll be murdered. 0.02% is the probability that you'll die in a car wreck. It's a fun game, isn't it? And finally, that big number at the very bottom is the probability that you'll get struck by lightning. Right here in the middle, somewhere between the probability of being murdered or winning the lottery, is the chance that your one vote will affect the outcome of the election. I'm sorry to say that any one vote is not very often going to swing the election. The chances of influencing the outcome is extremely small. In this case, in Wyoming, it's 0.001%. Which doesn't exactly give us a warm fuzzy about democracy and electoral politics, I suppose. However, I just want to be absolutely, positively, perfectly clear about something. I am not saying that you should not vote. Right, this is a fun exercise to think about how little any one vote matters in the election, but that is not, I just want to be perfectly clear, that is not me saying do not go out and vote. The point here is that your one vote is not going to, for most elections, most of the time, is not going to be the determining vote. And so your vote doesn't matter in the sense of affecting the outcome. There are, however, many other reasons why people vote, for instance, civic duty. So the point here is simply to show you how small of a number that probability is that we talked about earlier. Again, the main point is this. Individual causes come down to two main things. How big of a hassle is it, and how strong is your sense of civic duty? The benefits that people get in terms of policy actually have a very small impact. Again, let's go back to this formula to see why. We notice that the probability times the benefits determines how much of an effect that has on people's votes, and yet we just said that the probability is very close to zero. If you remember from basic math, what is 0 times anything? It's 0. So the fact that your vote, one vote, has very little chance of influencing it means that the benefits are almost 0 in this case, and so we can just simply drop those from the equation. We rearrange the last two, and what we get is the basic conclusion that the individual decision to turn out to vote really comes down to the duty versus the cost. When the hassle is larger than somebody's sense of civic duty, then they're not going to vote. And when their sense of civic duty is bigger than the hassles involved, then they will vote. A very close election can motivate turnout. It can cause some people to show up, but those are very rare. Very few elections are determined by just a few 10 or 100 votes one way or the other, and so most cases, most of the time, the closeness of the election doesn't really have a big impact. That's the take-home message about individual causes. Let's transition now to talk about mobilization. Again, the strongest individual influences are the cost, what we call the hassle of voting, and the sense of civic duty of the people to vote. Those are the two strongest influences. And for a lot of people, the costs outweigh their sense of civic duty. In 2012, only 57.7% of eligible Americans actually showed up to vote. A very large number just didn't even bother, and this was a presidential election. Now consider the 2014 midterm elections when there was not a presidential contest. Only 36.4% showed up to vote. What that means is that just a little more than 1/3 of the people who could have voted thought it was important enough for them to show up in 2014. A very small number. The individual influences, this cost versus duty formulation, can help explain why so few people show up to vote. However, if it were only about individual influences, those numbers would actually be a lot lower. Again, your individual vote very rarely influences the outcome, and so it comes down to the hassles, and there are myriad hassles involved with getting to the polling place, versus a sense of civic duty, and most people don't have a very strong sense of civic duty here in America. So these numbers would actually be much lower if it were only about this individual cost-benefit equation. So we have to add in something else. That's where mobilization comes in. Mobilization is designed to help overcome the costs of voting and to create incentives for people to show up at the polls that transcend things like the closeness of the election. Simply telling people your vote matters isn't going to work because most people understand that their one vote doesn't matter very much. So mobilization is really targeted to other motivations. So let's go back to our little graphic from before. Again, just to recap, we said that the strongest individual influences are cost and duty. We'll add those to our graphic at the bottom. And that leaves mobilization as the alternative or the other part of the explanation for why people turn out to vote. So let's talk about mobilization. You can think about the individual factors, especially the costs, the hassles. They create obstacles to voter turnout. Again, the reality is that one vote doesn't matter much for most elections. So most people rationalize not voting, just saying, well, it doesn't matter if I vote anyway. And then there are costs and hassles involved with voting that keep people from showing up however much they feel a sense of civic duty to vote. And again, a lot of people don't have a strong sense of civic duty, and so for most people at the individual level, the cost of the hassles outweigh that, and so they stay home in large numbers. First of all, what do we mean by mobilization? This is a word that you may not have run into. It's very common in political parlance and in media reporting, but it's not something you often come across in your everyday life. It has a very simple definition. It simply means the efforts by campaigns or parties to get people to the polls. Anytime a campaign, a candidate, or a party is trying to convince people to show up, we call that mobilization. The goal with almost all mobilization efforts is to overcome the obstacles for that candidate's supporters, only for their supporters, and that's important. We call this partisan mobilization, which is to say that the candidates and the parties only mobilize those citizens that are most likely to vote for them. If it seems a little cynical, well, it kind of is, but it is the reality of politics. Very few groups are out there trying to persuade everybody to show up. Most of the mobilization efforts, especially during the election season, are by the parties who are mainly targeting their supporters or people they think they can persuade to vote for them. So, for instance, a Republican candidate is not going to go to a Democratic neighborhood and try to get Democrats to show up at the polls. And a Democratic candidate is not going to Republican neighborhoods to try to convince Republicans to show up. The people in the neighborhood are not voting for those candidates, even if they do show up. And so mobilizing them would actually mobilize their opposition, and they don't want that. So let's talk about the things that work best when it comes to mobilization. What tactics, in other words, are used by the parties that have the biggest impact on convincing people to show up at the polls? The first is very simply, reduce the cost, reduce the hassle of voting, make it easier for your supporters to get there. Part of this is information, simply telling people where to vote, how to mail in the ballot, give them a ride to the polls. Several parties and candidates will often hire buses and vans to go and pick people up at their homes and drive them to the polling place. Calling people at their home on election day to remind them that today is election day and that they should vote is another way to reduce the information cost, to make it easier for people to know when and how to vote. Again, the basic idea here is that one of the best ways to mobilize people is just simply to make it easier for them to get to the polling place. The second most effective means of mobilization has to do with social pressure. Basically, make people feel bad about not voting. It's social pressure, not political pressure, and that's a very important distinction. Social pressure has nothing to do with the actual election or politics itself. It's simply creating a social stigma for people who don't show up to vote. One example of this would be a personal touch. Make the contacts and the elections meaningful for the individual voter. A lot of times campaigns will do things like use the first name of the voter. They'll say, instead of Mr. Gardner, they'll say Andrew. A lot of campaigns use casual phone calls. They're volunteers calling people up and casually talking to them, not reading a script. Voters and people in general are very good at knowing when they're being advertised to, and people don't want to be advertised, they want to be informed. And so a casual phone call works a lot better than a pre-recorded one. Other things such as handwritten notes and personal visits to the house to encourage people to show up also have a big impact. Let's look at an actual example here in Wyoming. This is a door hanger that was actually left on my door during this last election season. It's from one of our representatives here in Wyoming. And it's a nice mailer, it's an effective mailer, but notice at the very top, the volunteer who knocked on my door, I wasn't home at the time, left this campaign door hanger on my door, but she also wrote a handwritten message, "Sorry we missed you," and identified who she was, a volunteer walking with the representative. What this means is that people who come home, who were not there when the representative or the volunteer knocked on their door, are going to see a piece of campaign material, but they're also going to see a handwritten note to them. They're much more likely to actually read the note that's handwritten. And then, because they've read that, they'll look at the rest of the mailer. Without this personal touch, a lot of people would simply take it and throw it in the trash without looking at it. And so this is an example of mobilization that is very effective. It's one of the better ways to get people to notice your mailer or your information and to take notice of what you want to tell them. But there are some other aspects of social pressure as well. One of them is get supporters to contact their friends. This is a lot more effective than some random stranger who knocks on your house. A lot of campaigns will actually have volunteers make a list of their neighbors and their friends, and will send the volunteers to talk to those people. They know who they are, and they're more likely to listen. If a random stranger shows up, they're more likely to get the door slammed in their face, frankly. Another aspect is just simply to ask for a commitment to vote. A lot of campaigns will use what's called commitment cards. They'll have people fill out a card that says, "I am making a commitment to show up on election day and vote." And then they will either mail that commitment card back to them the week before the election, or they'll knock on their door and hand the commitment card back to them personally. Now, think about the psychology of that. Especially if it's your friend who is handing you back a commitment card, you're going to feel pretty bad if you made a commitment and then just didn't show up. Right? That's what we mean by social pressure. It's not convincing people that the candidate's policies are best for them. It's simply creating social pressure among friends to do that which you've said you're going to do. You make a commitment, you follow through on it. Candidates and campaigns often follow up very ruthlessly with people who fill out these commitment cards, sometimes knock on their door 3 or 4 times the last week of the election to make sure that they actually did show up. And a lot of times they won't even take the person's word for it. There are, in fact, right now, large voter databases kept by the Secretary of State in each state. So, for instance, in Colorado, during the last Senate election, both sides had lists of their people that they thought were their supporters. And every day, the Secretary of State would update which people had turned in their mail-in ballot or showed up at the polls. And if one of their supporters had committed to vote on, say, Wednesday, let's say that they knocked on their door and the voter said, "Yes, I'll vote on Wednesday," and they didn't vote on Wednesday, Thursday comes around and their name's still on the Secretary of State's website as having not voted, they'll go knock on the door and ask, "Why didn't you vote? Do you need a ride? Did something happen? What can we do to help it make it easier?" That creates enormous social pressure on voters because they're going to feel bad about not having showed up and not made good on their commitment. And finally, and this is one of the more cynical tactics, there are overt threats to people. We're not talking physical threats, we're not talking violence, we're talking something much more subtle. To give an example of what we mean by this, there's a Michigan experiment. It was done in, I believe, the city of Flint, Michigan, and political scientists went and divided the city of Flint, Michigan into 4 different areas, randomly selected citizens in that city. The first group received nothing, no mailer, nothing. The second 2 groups basically received a generic, you should get out to vote, it's your patriotic duty, trying to invoke people's sense of civic duty. But the last mailer is the best one. On this piece of paper, they listed the neighbors that lived in immediate vicinity to that voter. And they had checks or X's next to each person's name indicating whether they had voted in the previous election. And then they had the current election, which was all blank because it was before the election. Well, what the part of the mailer was that the political scientists were threatening to send mailers back after the election, updating the information. Basically, they were telling these voters, if you don't vote, we are going to tell your neighbors that you did not vote. That kind of overt threat, actually, of the three mailers used, actually had the biggest impact on increasing vote in that election. And experiments that have followed up have actually found that those type of overt threats have the biggest impact on getting people to vote. Simply saying it's your patriotic duty to vote doesn't have much of an impact. Most people know that, and yet they're not going to vote. But telling them, but if they know that there's a chance that everybody in their neighborhood and all of their friends are going to know that they don't vote, then they're going to be much more motivated to show up at the election. Again, it's creating a non-political motivation, social pressure. And it may not be pretty, it may not be nice, but it is effective. And campaigns have have been trying to find subtle ways to make these types of threats without the obvious voter backlash that can ensue. One of the ways they can do it is simply by putting in language that says voting is a matter of public record. Now, they're not telling you that they're going to tell your neighbors and friends that you didn't vote, but simply people knowing that voting is a matter of public record can trigger a large number of people to feel that social pressure and particularly that sense of shame for not having participated and cause them to go out to the polls. And, by the way, voting is actually a matter of public record. Every year, the Secretary of State office in every state, as we already talked about, provides a list of people who did and did not show up and voted in that election. So let's look at another example. This is a mailer sent in the 2014 election to citizens in Colorado and Wyoming. Colorado residents who were, for instance, students at the University of Wyoming, a lot of them received this. And this is one of the most effective mailers I've ever seen. It combines a lot of the mobilization tactics that we've been talking about. The first one, I think, is a very good innovation. Notice it says, want to know a secret of political campaigns. After you vote, campaigns take you off their mailing list and calling lists. And then they ask voters, sick of all the political junk mail filling up your mailbox? Tired of all the political phone calls jamming up your voicemail? Then mail in your ballot today. They're basically saying, we're going to harass you until you vote. And once you vote, then we're no longer going to harass you, so why not go ahead and vote? Again, this may not seem nice, it may seem cynical, but it is extremely effective. It is one of the more effective ways to motivate people to show up at the election. And on the back, this is the same mailers, just on the back. Notice at the bottom it says, don't forget to sign your ballot envelope. Ballots of unsigned envelopes will not be counted. That's good information that people need to know. But then it says, voting is a matter of public record. Your neighbors are counting on you to vote, so don't skip the election this year. Again, creating that social pressure. And then what I think this mailer does brilliantly is, in addition to creating the social pressure, they also provide very good information that make it easier for people to fill out these mail-in ballots. Right? Notice just above the voting as a matter of public record language, you have the two options for returning your ballot. They're basically telling them how they can turn in their ballot. And then if you look at the box off to the left, it says convenient ballot drop-off locations near you. They're telling people, in addition to, we're counting on your support, we want your commitment to vote, they're also saying, and by the way, here's an easy list of places close to you where you can drop this off. Again, combining the goal of reducing costs, making it easier for people to vote, with the goal of creating social pressure. This mailer is very effective precisely because in one piece of paper they combined both of those goals. So we've talked so far about what does work. Let's talk about a few things that all of the political science literature and all of the experimental studies have shown does not work. Mainly the issues and the policies of a candidate. Now that may surprise you, but honestly, people really aren't that concerned with the policies and the issues of the candidate. If you listen through the public opinion lecture for the same course, that should make sense. All right? People are not very ideological. People are not extremely motivated by things such as policies and the issues of the day. They have some opinions, but they're not strong and passionate about them. So appealing to those is probably not going to have as big of an impact. And besides, We already said that policies, issues, and what we called the benefits earlier really don't matter because each individual vote is unlikely to sway the election. So, candidate flyers and mailers and other mobilization efforts that focus on emphasizing the policies of the candidate are actually not very effective at getting people to turn out to vote. And at any rate, these candidates ought to be contacting their supporters. If they're only contacting their supporters, they're not going to need to try to persuade them. They're not going to need to convince people that they should agree with them on the issues. All they need to do is create social pressure to motivate people to vote and reduce the cost to make it less of a hassle. So again, issues and policies of the candidate has been shown in study after study not to be that effective at motivating people to turn out. A lot of this information comes from a book written by political scientists Gerber and Green in 2008. The book is called Get Out the Vote, and it includes dozens of field experiments, experiments done in actual elections that tested the various campaign tactics that were used. And here's what they found. They basically tested different mobilization tactics to see what had the biggest impact, what drove turnout up, and what had no impact or very small impacts. The least effective methods were these. Yard signs and billboards. Note that these are impersonal and they don't communicate a lot of information. And radio ads actually had very little effect. Radio, very few people listen to radio these days, and those that do probably have already made up their mind who they're going to vote for, but generally just motivating people to vote through these impersonal, large-scale types of advertisements doesn't have much of an effect. The tactics, however, that had the most effect were personal canvassing, basically knocking on somebody's door and asking for a personal commitment for them to vote. And this is especially true when the campaigns use neighbors to contact people in their neighborhood. If a person lives in house A, went and personally talked to all of the houses around that person on behalf of the candidate, then the people, their neighbors and their friends, were much more likely to show up to vote than those that didn't. Second, phone banks. A phone call is not nearly as personal as a knock on the door. However, when you use volunteers to make personal phone calls, it has a pretty big effect. What doesn't have an effect are so-called robocalls. Robocalls are basically pre-recorded messages. When the person picks up, they hear a recording reading a script. Those have almost no effect, but it is the personal phone calls from neighbors, the casual calls that we talked about earlier, those do have an effect. And those do motivate turnout. Again, because they provide information and they create that social pressure through that personal contact. Also, a candidate visit or a rally, when a candidate visits a small town and personally meets with people at a rally, that can have a small but long-term effect. What we mean by that is that it doesn't have as big a boost on the chances of people turning out, but the effect lasts for several weeks, actually. The way you can think about the most and the least effective tactics is to put all of this a little more simply. The least effective tactics are the ones that are impersonal, things like yard signs, right? A yard sign does not create social pressure. It does not make it easier for somebody to vote. We should, in hindsight now, have understood that yard signs were not very effective means of turning people out to the election. And things that provide irrelevant information, like the policies or the issue stances of the candidates. That's not the information that people need to make it easier to vote. The most effective tactics are the exact opposite of these. They are the personal touch, speaking with voters in person, calling them on the phone and talking to them in a casual, non-scripted way. That personal touch, writing handwritten letters to people when they're not home. And also providing relevant information. What we mean by relevant, again, is where to vote, how to vote, where their polling place is, or how they can fill out a mail-in ballot. That's relevant information because it makes it easier for somebody to know when and how to vote, and so that's going to have the biggest impact. Let's go back and summarize. We started this lecture wanting to understand, why do people show up on election day and why do others not show up on election day? We said that there are both individual and societal influences, and we have to understand both of those to make any sense of the most effective ways to increase turnout in America. So to mobilization, we'll add reduced costs and social pressure. Remember, individual factors include the costs and the duty. It really boils down to that. Policies don't make much of a difference. And so mobilization tactics are aimed at those. They can overcome a low sense of duty or the reality that one vote doesn't matter much by creating social pressure, non-political motivations to show up on the election day, and mobilization tactics can provide information to voters that make it easier for them to be there. In other words, it makes it less of a hassle for somebody to show up. They get a free ride to the polls, they get a reminder on election day, and other relevant pieces of information. Both individual and mobilization are equally important. Again, if it only came down to individual factors, even fewer people would show up on election day than they do now. And it's not simply mobilization. If everybody had a high sense of civic duty, then mobilization would be largely irrelevant, other than perhaps making it slightly easier. What mobilization does is create that non-political motivation, the social pressure, right, to help overcome the obstacles created by the costs and the hassles of voting. So again, just to reiterate, mobilization is really about overcoming those obstacles created by individual influences. This is why both are equally important. You cannot understand voter turnout without understanding both of them. This is why understanding both individual and mobilization is important for understanding turnout. Again, you cannot understand one without the other. What you have now, I hope, is a broader perspective on voter turnout. It is not simply individual motivations, right, the costs and the duties. And it's not simply mobilization, the efforts by the campaigns and parties. It is a combination of these. And lastly, remember that mobilization, as cynical as it may sound, is really targeted to potential supporters. Typically have as a result are campaigns that are designed to get strong partisans, Democrats and Republicans, or independents that will lean towards their side to show up to vote. That's all we have to say about turnout today. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope that next time you see a yard sign, what'll go through your head is, hey, that doesn't work.